The shackles were cold against my wrists, and the hum of the alien flagship vibrated through the metal bench beneath me like the purr of something enormous and hungry. I had not eaten in 2 days. My knees ached from the damp chill of the holding cell, and the thin civilian shirt I wore did nothing against the temperature they kept deliberately low. They wanted me uncomfortable. They wanted me afraid. What they did not understand was that I had been uncomfortable and afraid on battlefields across 6 star systems before most of their species had learned to build anything more dangerous than a satellite. My name is Elias Croft. I am 74 years old. I am a retired admiral of the United Earth Defense Force, and 2 days ago, I was a peace envoy on a routine diplomatic transit through the Varan corridor. Now I am a prisoner aboard the Council flagship Ascendancy, and the galaxy is about to learn a very old lesson about what happens when you take one of ours. It started simply enough. My shuttle, the Kingfisher, was a civilian craft carrying no weapons, no classified materials, and no military personnel other than myself, and I was retired. My crew consisted of 3 people. Philip Hale, my pilot, a calm and steady man who had flown me through worse situations than neutral space. Grace Whitfield, my communications officer and assistant, who had worked with me for 11 years and had never once lost her composure. And Simon Carr, a young diplomatic attaché on his first deep space assignment, eager and bright, and completely unaware that this trip would become the most dangerous moment of his life. We were 14 hours into our transit when the Dominion patrol fleet dropped out of faster-than-light transit directly in our path. 6 warships, heavy cruisers, all of them bearing the angular hull markings of the Dralith military arm. The lead vessel hailed us immediately, and the voice on the other end was not interested in conversation. They informed us that our shuttle had been flagged for carrying concealed weapons signatures, and that we were to power down all systems and prepare to be boarded. Philip looked at me. I shook my head. There were no weapons on that shuttle. I had personally overseen the loadout. This was a setup, and I knew exactly who was behind it. High Chancellor Zorath Venn had been pushing against humanity's presence in the galactic community for 2 decades. The Dralith were an old species, proud and territorial, and Venn was the worst kind of leader among them, the kind who measured power not by what he built, but by what he could take from others. He had spent years trying to rally the Galactic Council against Earth, claiming that humans were expanding too fast, growing too ambitious, reaching too far into territories that were not ours. He had failed every time because the evidence was not on his side. Humanity had never started a conflict. Every war we had fought in the past century had been defensive, and every single one had ended with the other side wishing they had never begun. But Venn did not care about evidence. He cared about optics, and a captured human shuttle with a fabricated weapons signature was exactly the kind of optic he needed. The boarding party was efficient. They came through our airlock in full tactical armor, weapons drawn, and they were not gentle. Philip was dragged from the cockpit and restrained. Grace was pulled from her station and pushed to the deck. Simon, who had never seen a hostile alien soldier up close, froze. I stepped between him and the nearest Dralith trooper and told the young man to stay calm. The trooper hit me across the jaw with the back of his armored hand. I tasted copper. I stayed on my feet. I have been hit harder by human drill sergeants. They separated us immediately. Philip, Grace, and Simon were taken to a different section of the Dominion cruiser, and I was transferred to the Ascendancy under heavy guard. They did not know who I was. My credentials identified me as a civilian peace envoy, which was technically true. My military rank was retired. My service record was classified at levels that a Dominion patrol captain would never have clearance to access. To them, I was just an old man in a wrinkled shirt with blood on his chin. They treated me accordingly. The holding cell aboard the Ascendancy was designed for species much larger than humans. The ceiling was 12 feet high, the bench was built for a body twice my width, and the gravity was calibrated slightly heavier than Earth standard, just enough to make every movement feel like wading through water. A petty cruelty, the kind of thing you do when you want to remind a prisoner that they are small. I sat on that bench for 36 hours before they came for me. When the guards arrived, there were 4 of them, 2 Dralith and 2 Vorathi, the reptilian species that served as Venn's personal security detail. They unlocked my shackles from the wall anchor but left them on my wrists, and they marched me through corridors that were clearly designed to intimidate. The Ascendancy was enormous. The hallways were wide enough for 3 Draelith to walk abreast, lined with polished dark stone and illuminated by strips of cold blue light. Every surface was carved with symbols of Draelith military history. Every archway was flanked by statues of past chancellors in poses of conquest. They wanted anyone who walked these halls to feel the weight of their civilization pressing down on them. I had walked through the ruins of civilizations older than the Draelith. I was not impressed. They brought me to the Grand Atrium. I had seen images of the Grand Atrium in diplomatic briefings, but nothing prepared me for the scale of it. It was a vast amphitheater, carved into the heart of the flagship, rising in concentric tiers that could seat thousands. Every tier was filled. Representatives from over 900 species occupied their designated sections, a dizzying array of forms and sizes and colors that would have overwhelmed anyone who had not spent decades navigating alien politics. The air itself seemed charged with the collective attention of beings who controlled empires spanning hundreds of light-years in every direction. And at the center of it all, elevated on a platform of black stone, stood High Chancellor Zorath Ven. He was exactly as the intelligence files described him, nearly 9 feet tall, with bone-plated skin, the color of dried clay, and 4 eyes arranged in a diamond pattern across his broad, angular face. His hands had 6 fingers each, thick and powerful, and they gripped the edges of a podium carved from the same dark stone as everything else on this ship. He wore ceremonial armor that covered his torso and shoulders in plates of polished metal, and the insignia of his office glowed faintly on his chest. He looked down at me as I was marched to the center of the atrium floor, and his expression was one of absolute contempt. He began speaking to the assembly in the Draelith trade language, which I understood perfectly, but did not let show on my face. He told them that the human threat had been exposed, that a human vessel had been caught smuggling weapons of mass destruction through neutral space, in direct violation of 14 galactic accords, that this frail, aging creature standing before them was proof that humanity could not be trusted, that their words of peace were lies, and that the time had come for the Council to act decisively against the human infestation. The word he used was infestation. The translation matrix rendered it precisely. The chamber responded with a wave of sound that I can only describe as collective amusement. Hundreds of species, looking down at me in my civilian clothes with shackles on my wrists and dried blood on my face, and they laughed. A Thessari delegate, a tall insectoid being with mandibles that clicked when it spoke, leaned forward and called out that perhaps the humans had sent their grandfather to fight their wars for them. The laughter doubled. A Vorathi representative suggested that if this was the best Earth could produce, the blockade would hardly be necessary. More laughter. A Krethian diplomat, a squat amphibian creature with bulging eyes, said that humans were short-lived vermin who had learned to build ships, but had not yet learned to build civilizations worth respecting. I stood in the center of that enormous room, 900 species mocking everything I was, and I did not flinch. Not because I am brave, though I like to think I have my moments, but because I have stood in worse rooms. I have stood on the bridge of a burning warship, with hull breaches on 3 decks, and enemy fire coming from every direction, and I gave orders that saved 4,000 lives. A room full of politicians laughing at me was not going to move me. Ven raised his hands for silence. The chamber obeyed. He descended from his platform and walked toward me, each step deliberate, each footfall heavy enough to vibrate through the stone floor. He stopped 3 feet in front of me and looked down, all 4 eyes fixed on my face. He was close enough that I could smell the metallic scent of his skin, close enough that I could see the faint scars along his jaw from some long-ago combat. He asked me if I had anything to say before the Council voted to impose full military sanctions and a blockade on every human colony in the galaxy. I looked up at him. I met all 4 of those eyes, and I said one sentence. "You have made a mistake." Ven laughed. The chamber laughed. It was the loudest sound I had heard since the bombardment of Kalem Station, and it was twice as hollow. Ven turned back to his podium, dismissing me with a wave of his hand, already moving on to the vote. But I noticed something that he did not. 3 delegates in the upper tiers did not laugh. One was a Fenari, a slender feathered species, with enormous dark eyes, and an intellect that had made them one of the most respected diplomatic civilizations in the galaxy. She was leaning forward in her seat, her feathered crest raised in what I recognized as alarm. Beside her, a Korvathi delegate, a pale-skinned humanoid with silver markings along her temples, had gone very still. And in the far corner of the chamber, a Maithori observer, one of the ancient amphibious species that rarely spoke but always watched, had begun tapping a sequence into its personal datapad. They knew, or at least, they suspected. They had dealt with humans before. They understood that the old man in shackles was not the threat. The old man in shackles was the warning. Because here is the thing that Ven and his laughing chamber did not know. When a ranking human officer is captured by a hostile foreign power and is not returned within 72 hours, Earth does not negotiate. Earth does not send diplomats. Earth does not file complaints with interstellar courts. Earth activates a protocol that has been triggered exactly 3 times in human history, and every single time, the entity that triggered it ceased to exist as a political power within a standard year. The protocol has a name. It is called homecoming. And as I stood in that atrium, listening to 900 species laugh at the idea that humanity could be threatened, I knew that the clock had already started. I had been in custody for 38 hours. In 34 more, the Galactic Council was going to learn what that word meant. I was taken back to my cell. The guards were rougher this time, emboldened by the laughter of their masters. One of them shoved me hard enough that I stumbled and hit the wall with my shoulder. I did not react. I sat down on my bench, folded my hands in my lap, and closed my eyes. The laughter did not bother me. What bothered me was the certainty of what was coming. I had spent 40 years of my life fighting wars so that humanity could live in peace. I had buried friends on planets whose names most people would never learn. I had given everything I had to build a future where the next generation would not have to fight. And now, because one arrogant chancellor had decided to make a point by capturing an old man, all of that work was about to be tested. I did not sleep that night. I sat in the cold, in the dark, and I counted the hours. 34 to go. The next morning, or what passed for morning on a ship where the lights never changed, a guard brought me a tray of food. It was Draelith rations, dense and bitter, and clearly not designed for human consumption, but I ate every bite. You do not turn down food when you are a prisoner. That is a rule I learned before I was 30, and it has kept me alive more than once. I ate, I drank the metallic-tasting water they provided, and I waited. At hour 44, they came for me again. This time, the escort was larger. 6 guards, full armor, weapons charged. They were not taking chances anymore. Someone, somewhere on this ship, had started asking questions about who I really was. I could see it in the way the guards watched me. Not with contempt this time, but with the first faint edges of uncertainty. They had been told I was a civilian, but civilians do not sit calmly in enemy cells for 2 days without showing fear. Civilians do not look at armed soldiers with the quiet patience of a man who has seen worse. Something had shifted, and they could feel it even if they did not understand it yet. They brought me to a smaller chamber this time, a formal tribunal room. Ven was there, seated at the head of a curved table, with 6 other Draelith officials. The room was equipped with broadcast equipment, cameras positioned at every angle, feeds going out live to the council network. This was not a trial, this was a performance. Ven wanted the galaxy to watch him humble humanity, and I was the prop he intended to use. The tribunal began with the presentation of evidence. A Draelith intelligence officer displayed the sensor logs from our shuttle, highlighting the supposed weapons signatures. They were convincing. I will give them that. Whoever had fabricated the data had done professional work. The energy patterns matched the profile of a Class 7 quantum warhead, the kind of weapon that could level a small city. If I had been anyone else, I might have believed it myself. But I was not anyone else. I had spent 6 years on the Joint Defense Research Council. I had personally reviewed the specifications for every weapon in Earth's arsenal, and more importantly, I had reviewed the specifications for every weapon we had chosen not to build. I knew the difference between a genuine quantum warhead signature and a forgery, the way a master painter knows the difference between an original and a copy. The tells were subtle, but they were there. When Ven asked if I wished to respond to the evidence, I stood up slowly, my shackles clinking against the table's edge, and I responded. I told the tribunal that the weapons signature they had presented used a frequency modulation pattern of 7.4 terahertz, which was correct for a Class 7 warhead. But I pointed out that the decay curve on the secondary emission spike was linear, when any genuine quantum warhead signature would show an exponential decay due to the Hargrove effect in confined antimatter systems. I told them that the scanning device used to capture this signature was a Drelith Model 9 series sensor array, and I recited its serial number from memory, because I had memorized the equipment manifests of every Dominion patrol vessel operating in the Veron corridor before I had agreed to transit through it. I told them that this particular sensor array had been flagged in 3 previous incidents where fabricated evidence had been used to justify Dominion seizures of neutral shipping. The room went very quiet. Ven's 4 eyes narrowed. He had not expected this. He had expected a frightened old man stumbling through denials. Instead, he was getting a technical deconstruction of his fabricated case, delivered with the calm precision of someone who had spent a lifetime analyzing threats far more sophisticated than this one. Several of the neutral delegates watching the broadcast began sending urgent messages to their homeworlds. I could see the Fenari ambassador in a small observation window above the tribunal room, her feathered crest fully raised now, her datapad active. She was requesting a formal recess to verify my claims. Ven denied it. He pushed the proceedings forward with increasing aggression, cutting off his own officials when they tried to ask follow-up questions, overriding procedural objections from the tribunal's legal advisor. He was losing control, and he knew it. During a brief recess, while I was held in an adjacent room under guard, the door opened, and a young Korvathi woman slipped inside. She was the attaché I had noticed in the grand atrium the day before, the one with silver markings along her temples. She was young, perhaps the Korvathi equivalent of 30, and she was clearly terrified. She glanced at the guards, who did not stop her, likely because they did not consider a junior diplomatic attaché a security concern. She asked me, very quietly, who I really was. I told her. I gave her my full name and my rank, Admiral Elias Croft, retired, formerly Supreme Commander of the United Earth Defense Force, holder of the Solar Cross, the Valor Distinction, and the Unity Medal with 4 clusters. The color drained from her face so fast I thought she might faint. She knew the name, not from recent events, but from history. Elias Croft was the commander who had led the human fleet during the siege of Harkon's Reach, the engagement that had broken the Varrock hegemony's armada and redrawn the territorial boundaries of 3 entire sectors. It was the single most decisive military victory in the last century of galactic history, and I had commanded it from the bridge of a carrier, with a cracked hull and half its weapon systems offline. She asked me why I had not told anyone. I told her I had not needed to. She asked me what was going to happen. I looked at her, and I told her the truth. I told her that Earth already knew I was here. I told her that a protocol had been activated the moment my shuttle failed to check in at its scheduled waypoint. And I told her that in approximately 26 hours, the Galactic Council was going to receive visitors. She left the room without another word. 26 hours. That was how long remained until the 72-hour threshold was crossed. I sat in that holding room and listened to the muffled sounds of the tribunal continuing without me, Ven's voice rising and falling as he delivered his performance to the cameras. And then, at hour 72 exactly, I felt it. A vibration. Not the normal hum of the flagship's engines. Something different. Something that came from outside the ship, transmitted through the hull plating like a distant earthquake. The lights in my holding room flickered once. The guards looked at each other. Then the alarm started. Every proximity sensor on the Ascendancy fired simultaneously, filling the corridors with a cascading wail that I had not heard in years but recognized instantly. Contact alarms. Multiple contacts. The kind of alarm that meant something very large and very dangerous had just appeared very close to this ship. The guards grabbed me and hauled me back toward the tribunal room, but the session had already collapsed. Drelith officers were running through the corridors, shouting orders into communication devices. Through the tribunal room's viewport, I could see it. Against the black canvas of space, lit by the distant light of a binary star, ships were appearing. Human ships. They dropped out of faster-than-light transit in perfect formation, one after another, each one materializing with a flash of displaced light that briefly outshone the stars behind it. I counted them as they appeared: 12 destroyers, 8 heavy cruisers, 6 battle cruisers, 4 carriers, 16 frigates in screening formation, 2 electronic warfare platforms, and at the center of the formation, massive and unmistakable, the Dreadnought-class carrier Resolve. 48 warships in total, the entire Third Fleet of the United Earth Defense Force, arranged in a combat spread that covered a volume of space large enough to swallow a small moon. Ven came storming through the tribunal room toward me, his 4 eyes blazing with something between rage and the first flicker of fear. He grabbed me by the front of my shirt, lifting me off the ground with one hand, and demanded to know what was happening. I looked at him, my feet dangling 6 inches above the floor, and I said what I had said the day before. I told you, you made a mistake. He dropped me. I landed on my feet, which at my age I considered a minor victory. And I straightened my shirt while the alarms continued to scream, and the Third Fleet held its position in the darkness outside, silent and waiting. The clock was no longer theoretical. The clock was a fleet. And it was running. Fleet Commander Dara Osei's voice came through on an open channel that every receiver on the Ascendancy picked up simultaneously. I heard it through the tribunal room speakers, and despite everything, despite the shackles and the bruises, and the 2 days without proper food, I felt something loosen in my chest when I heard her voice. Dara was one of the finest officers I had ever trained. She had served under me during the last 3 years of my active command, rising from a tactical lieutenant to a fleet-level strategist with a mind like a blade. She was calm under fire, ruthless in her calculations, and utterly incapable of bluffing. When Dara Osei made a statement, she meant every word of it. Her transmission was formal, precise, and devastating. She identified herself as Fleet Commander Dara Osei of the United Earth Defense Force Third Fleet. She stated that the Third Fleet had positioned itself at the legal boundary of Council sovereign space in accordance with the Galactic Conventions on Military Transit. She stated that Admiral Elias Croft, retired, a citizen and peace envoy of Earth, had been unlawfully detained by forces under the authority of High Chancellor Zorath Ven. She stated that his crew, consisting of pilot Philip Hale, communications officer Grace Whitfield, and diplomatic attaché Simon Carr, had also been unlawfully detained. And then she delivered her demand. Release Admiral Croft and his crew within 6 standard hours, or the Third Fleet will interpret their continued detention as an act of war against the sovereign territory and citizens of Earth, and will respond accordingly. She did not say what accordingly meant. She did not need to. 48 warships hanging in the void said it for her. The transmission went out on every council frequency. Every delegation on the Ascendancy heard it. Every world connected to the council broadcast network heard it. Within minutes, the entire galaxy knew that humanity had answered. I was taken back to my cell, but this time, the guards moved me quickly, and without the casual roughness of before. They were frightened. I could see it in the way their hands tightened on their weapons, in the way they kept glancing at the viewports as if expecting the human fleet to open fire at any moment. They locked me in my cell and left 2 additional guards at my door, and I sat on my bench and listened to the ship around me descend into chaos. Through the walls, I could hear raised voices, running footsteps, the deep thrum of the Ascendancy's own weapon systems powering up. Somewhere above me, in the grand atrium, the council was tearing itself apart. I did not need to be in the room to know what was happening. I had studied enough alien political systems to predict the sequence with reasonable accuracy. The delegates who had laughed at me 2 days ago were now turning on Ven, not out of sympathy for humanity, but out of self-preservation. Nobody wanted to be standing next to the man who had started a war with the species that had broken the Varrock hegemony. I learned later what happened in the atrium during those hours, pieced together from transcripts and diplomatic reports, and the Fenari ambassador's personal account, which she shared with me months afterward, over a drink on a space station neither of us had expected to visit. The Fenari ambassador, whose name was Ithari, had done something remarkable. The moment Dara's transmission ended, Ithari stood up in the grand atrium and requested access to the main display system. When Ven tried to deny her, 3 other delegations backed her request and cited procedural rules that even Ven could not override without dissolving the session entirely. Ithari took the display and began playing historical combat footage. She showed them the Siege of Harkon's Reach. The footage was 40 years old, pulled from Varrock military archives that had been declassified after the hegemony's collapse. It showed the human fleet, outnumbered 3-1, executing a series of tactical maneuvers so precise and so devastating that military academies across 12 species still used them as case studies. Human destroyers cutting through the Varrock formation like surgical instruments. Human carriers launching fighter wings in coordinated waves that overwhelmed point defense systems designed to handle threats from any direction. And at the center of it all, the command carrier Gallant, her hull scarred and burning, continuing to direct the engagement with an efficiency that the Varrock admiral later described in his surrender testimony as inhuman. I commanded that engagement from the Gallant's bridge. I was 34 years old. I had 3 cracked ribs, a concussion from a near miss that had buckled the forward bulkhead, and I had not slept in 41 hours. We won because we refused to lose. That is not poetry. That is the simple truth of human combat doctrine. We do not fight to prove a point. We fight to end the fight, and we do not stop until it is ended. The footage played for 11 minutes. When it ended, the grand atrium was silent. Then Ithari pulled up Earth's current military census. Not the classified version, which would have been far more alarming, but the publicly available figures. The numbers spoke for themselves. Humanity's fleet was not the largest in the galaxy. The Draelith had more ships. The Thessari had more carriers. The Varathi had more ground forces. But by every measurable metric of combat effectiveness, training quality, technological integration, and operational readiness, the human fleet was the most lethal fighting force in the known galaxy. Not by a small margin, by a margin that made the comparison almost embarrassing. Several species began formally withdrawing their support for Ven's tribunal. The Korvathi delegation walked out entirely, their ambassador pausing at the door to look back at Ven with an expression that needed no translation. Within 2 hours, 14 delegations had issued formal statements, distancing themselves from the proceedings. Within 4 hours, that number had doubled. But Ven did not back down. That was his nature. The Draelith did not retreat. It was a cultural imperative, so deeply embedded in their species that it bordered on biological compulsion. To a Draelith leader, backing down was not just a political failure, it was a fundamental violation of identity. Ven would rather burn than bend, and he was prepared to take everyone with him. He addressed the council with a declaration that made my blood run cold when I heard it later. He announced that Admiral Croft would be held as a political prisoner of the Galactic Council. He announced that any human incursion into Council space would be met with the full combined military force of the Dominion Alliance, a coalition of 6 species that had pledged mutual defense under his leadership. He stated that the human fleet was welcome to sit outside Council space for as long as it wished, but it would find that the Dominion was not the Varrock hegemony. He stated that numbers mattered, and the Dominion had the numbers. He ordered the Council's own defense fleet, a mixed force of ships contributed by member species, to form a blockade between the Ascendancy and the human fleet. It was at this point that a guard made a mistake that would, in a roundabout way, contribute to the resolution of the entire crisis. He left his personal datapad sitting on the ledge outside my cell while he went to use the sanitation unit at the end of the corridor. The datapad was unsecured, connected to the ship's internal broadcast feed, and positioned close enough to my cell's energy barrier that I could see the screen. I watched Ven's declaration on that little screen, and I shook my head. He was making the second oldest mistake in the book. He thought that the human fleet sitting quietly at the boundary was a sign of hesitation. He thought that Dara was waiting because she was afraid. He did not understand that in human military doctrine, the pause before engagement is not uncertainty, it is targeting. Every minute that the Third Fleet sat motionless in the void, its sensor arrays were mapping every ship in the Council Defense Fleet, cataloging weapons loadouts, identifying shield frequencies, calculating firing solutions. The calm was not mercy, the calm was preparation. A few hours later, when the guard had returned and retrieved his datapad, I heard footsteps outside my cell that did not belong to a Draelith. They were lighter, quieter, The energy barrier flickered, and Ithari stepped into view. She was smaller than I had expected. The Fenari were delicate creatures, their hollow bones and layered feathers giving them an appearance of fragility that was entirely misleading. Their species had survived 3 extinction-level events and had built one of the most enduring civilizations in the galaxy through intellect rather than force. Ithari looked at me with those enormous dark eyes and asked if she could sit. I told her the bench was uncomfortable, but she was welcome to it. She sat beside me and was silent for a long moment. Then she asked me the question that I had been expecting since the fleet arrived. She asked me if the humans would attack. I told her the truth, because she deserved the truth, and because at that point, there was nothing to be gained by ambiguity. I told her that if I was not released, yes, the Third Fleet would engage. Not because Earth wanted war, not because humanity took pleasure in destruction, but because Earth could not allow a precedent where its people were taken and held without consequence. I told her that the moment you allow someone to cage your citizens without response, you have told the entire galaxy that your citizens can be taken, and once that message goes out, it never stops. She asked me if I wanted war. I told her that I had spent 40 years fighting so that my species could have peace. I told her that the hardest thing I had ever learned in all those years was that sometimes peace requires the willingness to end it, that peace maintained through submission is not peace at all. It is just a slower form of surrender. She was quiet for a long time after that. Then she told me something that I had not expected. She told me that she had already begun organizing a vote of no confidence against Ven. She had the support of 43 delegations, and she needed 61 to pass the motion. She asked me how much time she had. I told her that Dara's deadline was 6 hours, and 4 of them were already gone. Ithari left my cell moving faster than I had seen any Fenari move. The deadline passed. 6 hours came and went, and I was still in my cell, still in shackles, still sitting on that uncomfortable bench. The Ascendancy's internal communications went silent for approximately 90 seconds after the deadline expired, a silence so complete that I could hear my own heartbeat echoing off the cell walls. Then a new transmission came through on every speaker on the ship. Dara's voice again, calm, measured. 3 words. Clock is running. No threat, no elaboration, no dramatic declaration of war. Just those 3 words, delivered in a tone that anyone who had served under Dara Ose would recognize immediately. It was the tone she used when she had already made her decision, and was simply informing the universe of its consequences. In my cell, I closed my eyes and began counting again. The Third Fleet moved at hour 81. Not quickly. Not with the sudden violence of an attack fleet surging toward its target. The human fleet advanced with the deliberate, measured pace of something that did not need to hurry, because it knew with absolute certainty that nothing in its path could stop it. Every ship maintained perfect formation. Every weapon system was hot, but not locked. Running lights were on. Identification transponders were broadcasting. The fleet was not sneaking. It was walking in the front door. I learned later that the advance was Dara's idea. She had argued against an immediate assault when the deadline expired, not out of hesitation, but out of strategy. A sudden attack would have given Ven the narrative he wanted, the aggressive humans striking without warning. Instead, she chose to advance slowly, giving every species in the Council Defense Fleet time to watch them come, time to check their sensors, time to run their own combat projections, and time to decide whether they wanted to die for Zorath Ven. It worked. The Council Defense Fleet had been assembled hastily from ships contributed by dozens of member species. It was large in number, but catastrophically fractured in cohesion. The ships had different communication protocols, different command structures, different rules of engagement. Some had crews that had never trained together, some had crews that actively despised each other, and none of them had ever faced a human fleet in combat. As the Third Fleet advanced, the Defense Fleet began to fragment. 3 Korvathi vessels were the first to break formation, powering down their weapons and withdrawing to a neutral position with a formal statement that the Korvathi people would not participate in an unlawful conflict. Within minutes, 2 Fenari frigates followed suit, going dark and drifting away from the blockade line, then a Thessari destroyer, then a Maithori patrol craft, Then 4 more ships from species I did not recognize. Ven was screaming orders from the Ascendancy's command bridge. I could hear his voice echoing through the corridors, even from my cell, a raw and furious sound that no longer carried the measured authority of a chancellor, but the desperate rage of a man watching his power disintegrate in real time. He demanded that the remaining ships hold formation. He threatened courts-martial, trade sanctions, territorial seizures. The ships kept leaving. Then he played his final card, and it was the worst one he could have chosen. The guards came for me again, more of them this time, 8 soldiers in full combat armor. They pulled me from my cell and marched me through the ship at a pace that made my old knees scream in protest. We passed through corridors filled with crew members who stopped and stared, their alien faces reflecting emotions I had learned to read decades ago. Fear, confusion, the dawning realization that they were on the wrong side of something they could not control. They brought me to the command bridge. The Ascendancy's bridge was enormous, a multi-tiered command center designed to coordinate the operations of an entire fleet. Dozens of officers manned stations arranged in concentric arcs around a central command platform where Ven stood, his bone-plated face illuminated by the glow of tactical displays showing the advancing human fleet. Behind him, the main viewport stretched from floor to ceiling, a massive window that offered an unobstructed view of space. Ven had me positioned directly in front of that viewport, standing, in shackles, visible to any ship with optical sensors pointed at the Ascendancy. Then he broadcast a message on the same open channel Dara had used. He told the human fleet that their admiral was standing on his bridge. He told them that any weapons fire directed at the Ascendancy would kill their own man. He told them to withdraw immediately, or be responsible for the death of their hero. A living shield. He was using me as a living shield. I stood there, looking out through that viewport at the void, and in the distance, growing slowly but unmistakably larger, I could see the resolve. The Dreadnought-class carrier was the largest warship in the human fleet, nearly 2 kilometers long, bristling with weapons systems that could reduce a planet's surface to glass. And on her bridge, I knew, Dara Ose was watching. Ven stepped up behind me, close. I could feel the heat radiating from his body, could hear the deep rumble of his breathing. He leaned down and spoke quietly, close to my ear, in a tone he probably thought was menacing. He told me that my fleet would not fire on him while I stood here. He told me that humans were sentimental creatures who valued individual lives over strategic necessity. He told me that this was why they would always be inferior to the Drelith. I almost laughed. Not because the situation was funny, it was not, but because Ven had just committed the oldest mistake in the book, so old that it predated space travel, predated civilization, predated recorded history. He thought that threatening one human would make the others stop. He did not understand. He could not understand. The Drelith were a hierarchical species. Remove their leader and they scattered. Remove their figurehead and the structure collapsed. They projected that psychology onto every other species because it was the only framework they possessed. But humans do not work that way. Humans are not held together by command structures. Humans are held together by stubbornness, by love, by the simple, irrational refusal to abandon each other. Threatening a human's leader does not make humans retreat. It makes them angry, and you do not want to make humans angry. From the resolve, a single craft launched. Every sensor on the Ascendancy tracked it. The bridge officers called out its profile, a light boarding shuttle, standard human configuration, no weapons signatures, no shields raised. It came fast, cutting across the void at full thrust, its running lights blazing in the darkness. And it was broadcasting. Not a threat, not a demand, a personnel file. My personnel file. Across every open frequency, the shuttle was transmitting my complete, unclassified service record. 40 years of service to Earth, 7 major fleet engagements, 4 colony liberations, the siege of Harkon's Reach, the Battle of Tremaine's Gap, the defense of New Kyoto, every campaign, every command, every commendation, the Solar Cross, the Valor Distinction, the Unity Medal with 4 clusters, 40 years of a man's life, reduced to data points and transmitted to every receiver in the system as a boarding shuttle screamed toward the most powerful ship in the Galactic Council's fleet. Ven watched the shuttle approach on the tactical display and ordered it destroyed. The Ascendancy's weapons officers hesitated. Their hands hovered over their consoles, and not one of them pressed the firing control. Because behind that shuttle, 48 warships had just locked their weapons systems onto the Ascendancy. Not fired, just locked. Every officer on that bridge could see the targeting indicators on their screens. Dozens of them, each one representing enough firepower to reduce this ship to vapor. The shuttle requested docking permission under Article 7 of the Galactic Conventions, the right of a combatant nation to retrieve its captured personnel through authorized boarding action. It was a legal provision that had been written into the conventions specifically because of an incident involving humans 2 centuries ago, and it had never been invoked since. Ven denied permission. The shuttle docked anyway. The sound of the breaching charge was something I will never forget. It was not an explosion. It was a sharp, focused crack, like a single handclap amplified to the volume of a thunderstorm. The shuttle had attached itself to the Ascendancy's forward hull, and its breaching team had cut through the outer plating with a precision charge that severed the hull in a perfect circle without triggering a single structural alarm. The ship's automated damage control system did not even register it as a breach. That was how precisely it was done. 12 human operators came through the breach and onto the bridge in under 90 seconds. They moved with the fluid, coordinated efficiency of a unit that had trained together so extensively that verbal communication was almost unnecessary. Full tactical gear, weapons at ready, but not one shot fired. They spread through the bridge in a pattern that placed at least 2 operators within arm's reach of every Dralith officer on the platform. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. 900 species were watching this on live broadcast, and every single one of them had just learned something new about humans. The lead operator approached me. She was tall, athletic, her tactical helmet obscuring her features. She stopped in front of me, looked at the shackles on my wrists, then turned to look at Ven. Then she reached up and removed her helmet. Naya Osei, 29 years old, Fleet Commander Dara Osei's daughter, and the finest tactical operator I had ever trained. I had recruited her personally 6 years ago when she was a junior officer with exceptional scores and a fire in her eyes that reminded me of her mother. She had risen through the ranks with a speed that surprised no one who knew her. She looked at me. She looked at Ven. She looked back at me. "Admiral," she said, "are you ready to leave?" I said not yet. I turned away from her and faced Zorath Ven. He stood on his command platform, surrounded by human operators who had not raised a single weapon, and for the first time since I had been brought aboard his ship, I saw something in his 4 eyes that I recognized. Not fear exactly, something deeper than fear, the realization that he had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the threat he was facing. I did not look at Ven when I spoke. I looked at the cameras. I looked at the broadcast equipment that was still transmitting to 900 species across hundreds of worlds. I looked at the lens that represented every being in the galaxy who was watching this moment unfold. And I spoke. "You mocked me because I was old," I said. "You mocked me because I was human. You mocked me because you thought we were small. So let me tell you something about small things." The bridge was silent. Every eye, every sensor, every camera was fixed on me. An old man in shackles and a torn shirt, standing on the bridge of the most powerful ship in the Galactic Council, speaking to the entire galaxy. I told them about Earth. Not the Earth they imagined, not the primitive backwater that the Dralith propaganda painted, but the real Earth. The planet that had frozen and thawed and burned and flooded and shaken itself apart more times than any geologist could count, and every single time, the small, stubborn creatures living on its surface had crawled back out of the wreckage and started building again. I told them about ice ages that lasted millennia and the humans who survived them with nothing but animal skins and stone tools. I told them about plagues that killed half our population and the civilizations we built on the bones of the dead. I told them about the wars we fought against each other, wars so terrible that we split the atom just to end them, and then we looked at what we had done and chose to build a future instead of destroying ourselves. I told them that humanity had been in the galactic community for less than 2 centuries, and in that time, We had never started a single conflict with any species. Every war we had fought, every engagement, every military action, had been a response to aggression directed at us. And every single one had ended the same way. I let the silence hold for 3 heartbeats. "You want war," I said. "We will give you war, but I promise you, every species that has heard those words from a human has wished they had not." I was not shouting. I was not posturing. I was speaking in the same quiet, measured tone I had used to brief my officers before every engagement I had ever commanded. The tone that said, "This is not a performance. This is a fact, and facts do not require volume." The grand atrium, which was receiving the bridge feed on its main display, erupted, not with laughter this time, with noise, with motion, with the frantic activity of 900 delegations suddenly grappling with the reality that they had been complicit in provoking a species they did not want as an enemy. Ithari moved. The Fenari ambassador had spent the last 6 hours building her coalition with the desperate energy of a woman who understood that the only alternative to political resolution was military catastrophe. She had gone door to door, delegation to delegation, calling in favors and making promises, and appealing to the basic survival instinct that every species in the galaxy shared. She needed 61 votes to pass a motion of no confidence against Ven. When the broadcast from the bridge hit the atrium, she had 58. 3 more delegations switched their votes in the 40 seconds between my last word and Ithari's call for a formal motion. The vote passed with 64 delegations in favor. Zorath Ven was stripped of his title as High Chancellor of the Galactic Council by a margin that left no room for procedural challenge. The collapse was total and instantaneous. The Dominion Alliance, Ven's coalition of 6 species, disintegrated before the vote count had finished displaying on the atrium screens. 2 of the 6 member species issued immediate withdrawals. A third arrested its own military liaison on the Ascendancy's bridge. The remaining 3 went silent, their diplomatic channels dark, their delegations evacuating their sections of the atrium with a haste that would have been comical under different circumstances. Ven's own military commanders turned on him with the efficiency of officers who had been waiting for permission to do what they already knew was right. 2 Dralith cruisers in the defense fleet transmitted surrender codes to the 3rd Fleet without being asked. A third repositioned itself between the Ascendancy and its remaining loyalist escorts, physically blocking any attempt at flight. The Dralith military had its own internal politics, and Ven had spent too many years burning bridges within his own ranks. On the bridge of the Ascendancy, Ven stood motionless, as Council security officers, a mixed unit of Fenari and Korvathi personnel, approached him. He did not resist. He did not speak. He stood with his 4 eyes fixed on me, and I could see in those eyes the terrible understanding of a man who had built his entire career on the assumption that the galaxy was full of species weaker than his own, and had just discovered that he was wrong. They took him away. The fabricated weapons charges against me were formally vacated by the tribunal within the hour. The Council issued an unprecedented formal apology to Earth, transmitted on every diplomatic channel, and archived in the permanent record of the Assembly. Naya removed my shackles. The metal fell away from my wrists, and I rubbed the raw skin beneath them, and felt, for the first time in 4 days, something that was not tension or calculation, or the cold patience of a man waiting for a crisis to resolve. I felt tired, bone-deep, marrow-level tired, the kind of exhaustion that does not come from physical effort, but from the sustained expenditure of willpower that is required to remain calm when everything around you is designed to make you afraid. She escorted me off the Ascendancy and onto the boarding shuttle, and 20 minutes later, I was standing on the flight deck of the Resolve. Dara was waiting. She was standing at attention when I came through the airlock, her uniform immaculate, her expression controlled, every inch the professional flag officer that the situation demanded. She saluted. I returned it, and it felt strange, the old muscle memory of a gesture I had not performed in years, activating as naturally as breathing. Then she dropped the salute and hugged me, and the formality dissolved, and for a moment, we were not an admiral and a fleet commander, but 2 people who cared about each other, and were very, very relieved that the worst had not happened. Philip, Grace, and Simon were already aboard. They had been recovered from the Dominion cruiser by a separate boarding team that had executed their extraction with the same quiet professionalism as Naya's unit. Philip had a bruised cheekbone and a calm expression. Grace was already composing a formal incident report, because Grace Whitfield did not process stress through emotion, but through documentation. Simon was sitting in a corner of the medical bay with a blanket around his shoulders, and a look on his face that told me he would never be the same person he had been 4 days ago, which was sad and necessary, and the way these things always went. Naya brought me coffee, real coffee, from Earth, brewed in the officer's mess, and carried to the observation lounge where I had settled into a chair that was, after 4 days on Draylith benches, the most comfortable thing I had ever sat on. I held the mug in both hands and let the warmth seep into my fingers, and looked out through the observation window at the Council flagship shrinking slowly in the distance as the Resolve began its withdrawal. I did not feel proud. People often expect that. They expect the old soldier to look back at the moment of victory and feel vindication, feel the satisfaction of having been proven right. But I did not feel any of those things. I felt the weight of what had almost happened. I felt the closeness of it, the razor-thin margin between a political crisis resolved through posture and pressure, and a full-scale military engagement that would have killed thousands of people on both sides. I felt the fragility of the peace I had spent my life building, and I felt the familiar, exhausting knowledge that it would be tested again. Not if, but when. Because the galaxy is vast and memory is short, and there will always be another Ven, another chancellor or warlord or ideologue, who looks at humanity and sees something small and weak and worth pushing. In the weeks that followed, the ripple effects of what the press back on Earth was already calling the Croft incident spread across the galaxy like waves from a stone dropped in still water. 14 species that had previously dismissed humanity as a minor power formally requested diplomatic partnerships with Earth. The applications arrived so fast that the diplomatic corps had to create a new processing division just to handle the volume. The Fenari signed a mutual defense accord with Earth, their first military alliance in 3 centuries. Ithari, the ambassador who had organized the vote of no confidence, personally traveled to Earth to sign the document in a ceremony that was broadcast across Fenari space. I attended as a civilian guest, and she introduced me to the Fenari audience as the man who had reminded the galaxy that strength and restraint are not opposites. The Korvathi opened their historical archives to human researchers, something they had refused to do for any species in over 1,000 years. The archives contained records of civilizations that had risen and fallen before most current galactic powers had developed written language, and the Korvathi council elder who authorized the access told a human journalist that any species capable of producing someone like Elias Croft had earned the right to learn from history. The Thessari Military Academy rewrote its tactical curriculum to include human engagement doctrine. The Maithori, who rarely spoke to anyone, sent a single diplomatic message to Earth's government that contained 12 words in their ancient language. When translated, it read, "We have watched you for a long time. We are no longer concerned." And across the galaxy, in council chambers and military headquarters and diplomatic offices on hundreds of worlds, a quiet consensus formed. It was not a treaty or a resolution or a formal agreement. It was something simpler and more powerful. An understanding. Humanity was not to be mocked. Not because humans were dangerous, although they were. Not because human ships were powerful, although they were. But because humanity was dangerous and powerful, and still chose, every single time, to try talking first. Because when you pushed them, they pushed back with everything they had, and then they extended their hand again. Because they were the species that could have conquered the galaxy, and instead chose to join it. That is the thing the galaxy keeps forgetting, and the thing humanity keeps having to remind them. I went home after the ceremony, home to New Zealand, to the small house on the coast where I had lived since my retirement. The house is nothing special. 3 rooms, a kitchen, a garden that I tend with more patience than skill, and a view of the ocean that reminds me every morning why the universe is worth protecting. I put my bags down, made myself a cup of tea, and sat on the porch and watched the waves. I am 74 years old. My knees hurt when it rains. My hands shake sometimes when I am tired, a tremor that started after the Battle of Tremaine's Gap and never quite went away. I am an old man who should be done with the business of saving the galaxy, and would very much like to spend the rest of his years growing tomatoes and reading books, and watching the sun set over the Pacific Ocean. But I know how the galaxy works. I know that somewhere out there, on some world I have never visited, some ambitious leader is looking at the distance between their empire and Earth, and calculating whether the gap is wide enough to test. I know that the peace I helped preserve is temporary, because all peace is temporary, because peace is not a destination but a practice, something you have to choose and defend and rebuild every single day. So I tend my garden, I read my books, I drink my tea and watch the ocean, and I wait, with the quiet patience of a man who has survived worse, for the next time the galaxy forgets what it learned. They called me an old man. They were right. But old men remember what young empires forget, that the ones who survive are never the strongest. They are the ones too stubborn to die.